Hey guys, today we're doing paper piecing, and if you've never done paper piecing before, you are in exactly the right place because I'm going to walk you through everything step by step. So before we get going, let's start with everything you need to do this tutorial. So starting with the pattern, this is the letter A from my Varsity Letters quilt pattern. You can actually get this block for free if you go to patchandot.com/varsity, and there will be a link to this as well below. So go ahead, grab your pattern, and you can sew along with me. This block, you can see I've printed it on just your standard kind of laser DeskJet office printer paper. The thinner the paper you can find, the better. So you can actually, this is just what I had on hand, but at places like the dollar store or sometimes even, your mom and pop corner shop, you can find a cheaper, lighter weight paper that actually works better. So the lighter and thinner and more transparent you can find, the better, but really any old paper will do. So in addition to your printed pattern, you will also need scissors. That's paper scissors, not fabric scissors, because you're going to be cutting out the pieces of this pattern. You'll need a rotary cutter. You'll also need a clear acrylic ruler and a little bookmark or postcard piece of cardstock, anything with like a little bit of a heavier weight and a perfectly straight line. And of course, you'll need your fabric. This pattern uses two colors. I'm using this yellow dot and this blue dot. I'll use the yellow for the letter A and the blue for the background. So you just need any two fabrics, ideally in contrasting colors. And that's all you need to get started. So the first thing you're going to do is, as I mentioned, cut out your paper sections from the overall pattern. I've already done that, so let me just show you that here. So we've got the center of the A, the bottom, and the top. Most paper piecing patterns will come pre-shaded like this so that you can kind of distinguish as you go along which fabric goes where. If you're like me and you get easily confused, especially not so much in a simple pattern like this where there's only two colors, but in more complicated patterns, you may choose to also take some colored pencils and shade in the areas just as a little reminder to yourself as to what fabric goes where. More than once I've I've reversed my fabrics and put them in the wrong place. But with a simple pattern like this, straight lines, two colors, one's shaded, one's not, it's pretty straightforward. So the first thing you're going to do is take your little piece of cardstock or postcard, and we're going to score every single line that you see on your printed pattern. So I've put this along the diagonal line of the A. Going to proceed through the entire thing, creating fold lines. This is going to help us in two ways. We're going to use it first as kind of a template to cut out our fabric pieces in advance, and then it's going to help us later on when we're sewing and trimming. When we get to that trim part, it helps to have all these pieces folded back in advance. So that's the center of the A, that's the more complicated part. These are the dead simple parts, the top and bottom of the A, just two little lines. So, as I mentioned, we're going to use this first as a little template to cut out our fabric pieces. Some people actually like to print an extra copy or copies and kind of cut out these individual sections separately and use them as templates. That's great to do, especially if you're doing the same block over and over again, but we're just doing this once, and I like to save paper, so we're just going to use these as templates. I actually cut out my fabric pieces ahead of time, but I'm going to show you just how this is done so you have an idea. So blue is my background. So on this piece, this is the bottom, this is the top of the A. Little tip here, since we're all sewing the A together, you can see at the bottom of the center of the A there's two little triangles, and then here's two little triangles on this third piece. That tells you that this is the bottom and they join up together here. This is the top, where you can see one arrow, just match the arrows together, and that's how you know which, you won't get them kind of flip-flopped or whatever the way I just did. So we want to cut our fabric pieces, and we're going to use these folded pieces as a template. So if blue is my background fabric, that means I want the center piece of the bottom to be blue. So I need to cut a piece that's the same size as this number 2, the section here labeled number 2, but at least a 1/4 inch bigger on all sides. And if you're just getting started, be really generous with your fabric because it will save you some time in the long run. So I'm gonna take this fold, place this on top of my fabric. You can see it creates a perfect little guideline for me to know what size piece I need. Place that over my fabric. I've got a 1/4 inch on this side. I'm gonna be really generous, nudge this over a little bit. Be generous on this side too. The more experience you get, the more precise you can get, but if you're just starting out, like I said, be generous with your fabric. So cut that, and here we'll have a perfectly sized background piece to get us started on the bottom here for the bottom of the A, and then you'll need a foreground piece for the number 1 here. So you can see how each section is labeled 1, 2, 3, and so on. All you need to do is follow the numbered order for your pieces. So I cut the blue first, but really that's piece number 2. Piece number 1 is a yellow piece of foreground that's shaded in the bottom left leg of the A. Here's a little tip. So I cut that using this on top. When we sew, we're actually going to be sewing right through the paper and right through the fabric along these printed lines. The fabric right side is going to be on the reverse blank side of the paper. So when you're cutting out, it's actually a great practice. It doesn't matter so much for these pieces that are symmetrical because they'll work either way, but it's a good habit to build when you get into more complicated paper piecing patterns and you're dealing with some pieces that are asymmetrical. You always want your printed template to be facing up against the wrong side of your fabric, and then the right side of your fabric is on the blank side of the page because that's where it will actually appear and come together when we sew this. So if I need a piece for the bottom of my A, I'll go ahead and cut it like this. And now I've got fabric for the first 2 pieces of my template. So how do we get this onto the paper, you ask? What we're gonna do is line this up on the reverse side of our template. Here you can see I've got it, here's the line where we're going to sew, and I've got piece number 2, 1/4 of an inch over the line. Now I'm going to take piece number 1, actually let's do that the other way. Let's take piece number 1, it's parallel with the template piece. It's 1/4 of an inch to one side of piece number 1. Flip that over. I'm going to take my number 2 piece. I'm going to line that up with the existing yellow piece. So when I sew, I'm going to sew along here on the reverse side, and then I'm going to flip this over and press. So you want to follow the numbers in order. Once you get a little more practice, you may find that you want to favor your kind of flipping order, so that the dark side is the one that kind of gets the seam. So this will, you won't see the yellow through this, but if we were to do it the other way with the seam on this side, you might see some of the blue peeking through. So we'll do it that way. And it is also following the number order. So again, I've got my 2 pieces, they're lined up 1/4 inch to one side. I'm gonna take this to my machine and sew right through the paper along the slide. So you sew the line, but when you have no overlapping lines like this, it's just very simple, 3 rectangles, 3 squares in a row, 2 rectangle, square, rectangle. You're just gonna sew all the way across the seam allowance from one side to the other. So let me take this to my machine. I will be back in 1 second. So you can see, hopefully I've sewn right through my paper. I'm using a brightly colored thread here, so to hopefully increase the chances of you being able to see this stitch line. A note about the stitching, reduce your stitch length to something smaller than you usually use. I use kind of like somewhere between 1.5 and 2. The reason for this is that later on we're going to tear the paper away once your whole block is finished, and the smaller stitch length makes it easier to tear. So we have sewn through the paper. Like I said, I used a bright thread color here, but you can use, you know, white or a thread that matches your fabric the same way you normally would when making any kind of patchwork quilt. So I've sewn my line. I'm going to take this to my ironing board, fold this over, and press. And I'll be right back. So here you can see we've got a really nice neat line between our A and our background. We're ready to add the next yellow piece, but before we do that, what we want to do is trim away this extra fabric. So you can see here the background piece needs to be covered by the blue, but only to the extent that it covers the block plus 1/4 of an inch. All of this is extra and we don't want all this extra bulk within our block. So you've already got your folded lines on the paper. At this point, all you need to do is fold it back over. This is your 3. Take your clear ruler and line it up so that you have a 1/4 inch to one side. Trim. And then we're ready to grab our other piece of yellow, which I have over here, and we're going to do the same thing on this side. I'll just line this up with my neatly cut line. I'm going to sew along this line and then fold it back over. So here's my 3rd piece sewn for section 3. I'm going to fold this over and press on my ironing board. I'll be right back. So that's one whole section almost done. Before we move on, let's trim it to the edges of the paper. Out of the way. So take your clear ruler. Your seam allowance is included in the template, so all you need to do is trim around the edge. If you've got some nicks in your paper for one reason or another, you can just rely on your clear ruler to make sure you've got that straight 1/4 inch line. So trimming this all around the perimeter. And that's it. That's the bottom of the A already done. So that one, as you can see, is very simple. Squares and rectangles. It's about as easy as you can get for paper piecing. So what happens when you have some asymmetrical shapes, some triangles, or something even fancier? Let's talk about that. So rectangles, as we've seen, are pretty easy to cut to size. But when we have a triangle, how do we get that? How do we make sure we get the exact diagonal that we want? So I've got a piece, a wider strip that I know is wide enough to accommodate this triangle here. What I'm going to do again is rely on my folds. So again, right side down, wrong side up, and against the back of your paper so that when we flip it over, the right side of the fabric is on the blank side of the page. Now all I'm going to do, make sure I have enough fabric around the outside. This is plenty. Now fold it back over. That's the nice, neat diagonal line that I need. And edge it down here a little bit. Then take your ruler, keeping it in place. Take your ruler and make sure you cut 1/4 inch to the side of that diagonal line. So that gives you your overlap and your seam allowance. So for one side, so that will be that side of my A. Do it for the other side. Around. So now I have triangular pieces for those sections. I'm going to take that over to my machine along with my simpler shapes. So I'll be starting with a 1, which is again, I've cut it out ahead of time. Here you have a triangle, but because your sewing line is kind of between two straight edges, you don't need to cut a triangle necessarily in advance. I just cut a rectangle that I knew was big enough to cover that triangle, and same with this shape. I just cut a yellow piece for the A that I knew was big enough to cover this kind of rhombus or whatever you might call that here. So, so I'm going to start with a 1 and a 2, and I'll go back to my machine and sew these just to give you an idea. This yellow will cover this center piece of the A. I'll have my blue background for that triangle that's in this very center of the A, and it will get sewn along that line. And then when I flip it up, it will cover this, you know, what's entirely a triangular shape, but then we'll trim it down. So you can start with rectangles, end up with triangles. Be right back. So here you can see I have covered sections 1 and 2 completely with fabric, and we're going to rely on our folded edges again to trim that up. Again, folding and then placing your clear ruler a quarter from the edge. Again on the other side. Just double check to make sure we're, yep, good here. Sometimes once you start getting into triangles and things, there can be a tendency for the fabrics to shift around, so just check to make sure there's nothing kind of folded or wrinkled underneath. And then when we flip it over, ta-da, nice and crisp. So you can see how the center of the A is starting to form up. We need to trim the bottom of piece 2. You can see there's tons of extra fabric there. Okay, excellent. And then you just keep going following the numbered order. Next is number 3. Got a piece pre-cut here, so I'll place it on the line that's already trimmed, fold it over to double check that there's enough fabric. And here you can see, what you want to see is that you're getting like a 1/4 inch clearance on either side of the lines that you're working with. Next, looks like we have that, so I'm going to go ahead and sew that. Now we've got the center of our A. Next is pieces 4 and 5. Now again, these look like funny shapes that you might want to cut to size, but actually what you can do when you see shapes like this is just cut a long strip, rectangular, long enough that you know is going to cover the thing in its entirety, because what we're doing is sewing and flipping along this edge, and then your trimming will take care of the kind of fanciness of the shape. So that speeds things up quite considerably. So I'm going to do those 2 pieces next. Okay, really starting to look like an A now. Just trim it up, and then we're ready for those odd shaped pieces that we cut at the beginning. So these will go on either side. Just take those to my machine. Okay, side pieces are on, so let's trim that center portion. And then just one more section to go. Okay, center of the A, bottom of the A, they'll come together like this. We just need to do the top portion, so I'm going to grab my template, grab my pieces that I've pre-cut if I can find them in all the scraps, and then we're good to go. So here I have my pre-cut pieces for the top of the A, a yellow section for the middle, blue pieces for either side. Line those up. If you have at your sewing table a light, you can hold these up to the light. That's a good way of making sure that you've got that 1/4 inch coverage on either side. Okay, here's the top of our A. Trim that up, and then we'll sew the pieces together. Okay, that's the top. Here's the bottom, and here's the middle. So again, in this pattern, so this again, a varsity letter pattern, all of my patterns have this, but whenever there's sections, sometimes you get lucky and your letter is just one single template without these different sections. But for more complicated or more interesting letters, there will be these arrows telling you exactly which piece needs to be sewn to which other piece. So I'm going to sew the top of the A to the top of the middle section, and the bottom of the A to the bottom of the middle section, just following these single and double arrows right here. Okay, there we have it, one paper pieced varsity letter A. I'm just going to trim this up a little bit, just get a few stray threads here. You'll see that the top and the bottom of the A look a little on the chunky side. That's because once this gets sewn with a border into the rest of your project, you'll lose a little bit. You'll lose a quarter inch of this top, bottom, and side, which will make it more proportional with the rest of the letter. So you can see on the back there, we've got our pieces sewn together. Just getting some straight heads. The very last step of paper piecing is to remove the paper. It's personal preference, but I like to leave my paper on until my blocks are sewn into the rest of the quilt, just because it kind of helps them keep their structural integrity until that time, until they're part of the larger piece. So I like to leave my paper on, but when you do get to that stage, basically you're just going to be doing like so, tearing along those lines, pulling it out, and that's it. Okay, that's the letter A. Like I said, you can get this free block template at the link below. And if you have any questions at all, please put them in the comments below.